Things I think I know. You can come up with your own list. I'm looking at a camera right now. Feel like I know that if I know anything. I'm wearing a blue shirt. Also an item of apparent obvious knowledge that it would be crazy for me to deny. I look down, it's blue, I'm wearing it, the end. I'm on UCF's campus. I mean, I look around, I'm in right now the Faculty Multimedia Center. I remember walking onto campus from my car and then walking into this building. I obviously know that I'm on campus. Here's another one. I have two hands. I mean, here they are. I can see them. They seem to be attached to me. I invite you to do something similar. Make your own list of very basic, everyday, perceptual bits of knowledge that you probably have never actually reflected on, but that obviously you know. External world skepticism is the position that we know very little to nothing of what we ordinarily take ourselves to know. In particular, according to the external world skeptic, we don't know any of the items on this list. I don't actually know that I'm looking at a camera. I don't know that I'm wearing a blue shirt. I don't know that I'm on UCF's campus. I don't even know that I have two hands. For that matter, I don't know I have a body at all. More precisely stated, the external world skeptic says this: I don't know whether there is an external world outside my own mind. Maybe there is, according to the external world skeptic, but I don't know it. So it's important to see that external world skepticism does not make the positive claim that there's nothing outside of your mind. Instead, the claim is there might be, but you can't know it. Descartes used a number of hypotheses, skeptical scenarios, to provoke us into doubting things that we ordinarily wouldn't doubt. He used the dream hypothesis to call into doubt our beliefs about being in a classroom or being in a dorm room or wearing a blue shirt. He used the evil demon hypothesis to call into doubt even more of the things we take ourselves to know, including that we have bodies, including that there is a physical world outside our own minds, including things like 2 + 2 being 4. If you're not as moved by the evil demon hypothesis, here's a modern twist on the evil demon. This is a brain in a vat hypothesis. It's going to give us the same sort of sweeping doubt with maybe a little bit less radical than the evil demon hypothesis, but for our purposes, it will serve quite well. The brain in a vat hypothesis says, you are right now, you're a bodiless brain floating in a vat, being pumped full of vivid experiences by a supercomputer. Now, one thing that's important is that what it's like to be a brain in a vat is exactly what it's like to be you right now. So it doesn't hurt to be a brain in a vat. It's not sort of foggy. The experiences of being a brain in a vat are exactly like the experiences you're having right now. We can imagine that the supercomputer is controlled by a mad scientist, again, intent on deceiving you. The mad scientist maybe even is sort of delighted by not just deceiving you in the ordinary way, by making you think you're going through life walking around in a city when in fact you're asleep, so to speak. You're invatted in the goo in his laboratory. But he also sprinkles some things in there, like, I'm going to give this subject the experience of learning about brains in vats. And then I'm going to make them think, no, that can't be. I'm not a brain in a vat, when in fact they're a brain in a vat all along. That is the brain in a vat hypothesis. Here is an argument for external world skepticism. The view that you don't know that there's a world, a physical world outside of your own mind. So the conclusion is, therefore, I don't know I have hands. I mean, that's a pretty radical conclusion, right? Lift up your own hands for a second and look at them. Sure, seems like you know that. So this argument had better be pretty powerful. And it is. Here's the first step. If I know I have hands, then I know I'm not a brain in a vat. If I know I have hands, then I know I'm not a brain in a vat. Here's another way of putting this. The only way that I can know I have two hands in front of me is if I also know that I'm not a disembodied brain in a vat without hands floating in goo being pumped full of experiences as if it actually had hands. The first premise is, if I know I have hands, then I know I'm not a brain in a vat. And our conclusion is, I don't know I have hands. This is going to be a modus tollens argument. So its second premise is just, I don't know I'm not a brain in a vat. The form of this argument is if P then Q, not Q, therefore not P. This is a modus tollens argument, and that means it's valid. The question then is, what's going on with the two premises? Why should I believe them? Well, at a really simple level, let's start with this one. I don't know that I'm not a brain in a vat. I mean, how could you know? How could you possibly know such a thing? You may claim to know that you have hands, but you shouldn't claim to know that you're not a brain in a vat. How could you? I mean, if you were, you wouldn't be able to tell the difference. That's the basic idea. We'll make that idea more precise in a second. The first premise says, knowing that you have hands requires you to know that you're not a brain in a vat. And so if you don't know you're not a brain in a vat, then you don't know you have hands. Let's focus on premise one and the defense of this premise involving the closure principle on knowledge, and then we'll discuss that second premise. They say that you know you're getting old when you start to get into bird watching, and that's something that I've been doing recently. So I guess that's a sign of old age, that I'm getting a little older. It's fun. It's kind of like real life Pokemon, I guess. I want to tell you a little bit about goldfinches. Goldfinches are small yellow birds, sort of bright yellow birds, about the size of a sparrow, with distinctive black markings on their backs and face. Those black markings can be more or less stark. The yellow can be brighter or softer. Here's a picture of a bird. Now, initially, given what I just said, you might say, oh, that's a goldfinch. There you go. It has all of the right features of a goldfinch. You might even, if you were particularly hasty, have taken yourself to know that that was a goldfinch. But here's a bit more information. Yes, there are goldfinches in this area in Central Florida. There are also pine warblers, though. And pine warblers look from a distance and actually quite close up indistinguishable from goldfinches. They are small yellow birds of exactly the same size, with the same beak shape, and often they have the very same black markings on both their face and back. So given that new information, it should be really clear that you don't know the picture I just showed you was a picture of a goldfinch. I'll confess, I don't know either, actually. And it's pretty clear why not. You don't know that that picture was a picture of a goldfinch because you don't know that it wasn't a picture of a pine warbler. Here's another case I want to give you. Here's a picture of my friend, Mike. Here he is. Mike's a bearded guy, dressed nice, handsome dude. Except, is it a picture of Mike? Here's a picture of his identical twin, Ike. As you can see, Ike looks exactly like Mike, down to the last detail. Indeed, even their own mother, Mike and Ike's own mom, very close up, can't tell the difference between Mike and Ike. So I said, oh, here's a picture of Mike. But as soon as I introduced to you that he has a twin brother that you can't distinguish from Mike, your confidence that you knew that the picture I showed you was a picture of Mike should now be undermined. I mean, after all, you can't tell that it wasn't Ike. Here's a really plausible constraint or principle that seems to govern knowledge or claims to know. This is sometimes called closure. There are different formulations of closure, but we're going to go with this one, which is one of the more plausible ones. And it seems to undergird our reaction to both the Mike and Ike case and the goldfinches and warblers case. Here's what closure says. If I know that P entails Q, then I know that P only if I know that Q. Let me say that again. If I know that P entails Q, then the only way I can know that P is if I also know that Q. Let's take specific instances of P and Q. These are variables. Let's let P be, that was a picture of Mike I showed you earlier. And let's let Q be, that was not a picture of Ike. Now, I noted that Mike and Ike are different people who are identical twins. So if the picture I showed you was a picture of Mike, it was just a picture of one person, then that logically entails it was not a picture of Ike. I mean, and vice versa. If it was a picture of one, then it wasn't the picture of the other. What this means is that you know that what you saw was a picture of Mike only if you know it wasn't a picture of Ike. And that seems really plausible. In order for you to know that this was a picture of Ike, you'd better know it was not a picture of his identical twin who's not him. You have to be able to rule that out, rule out that possibility, because that possibility is incompatible with what you claim to know. First premise says that if I know I have hands, then I know I'm not a brain in a vat. Or the only way that I can know that I have hands is if I also can rule out in a knowing way the hypothesis that I'm not a brain in a vat. And you might say, well, why should those go together? Why can't I know that I have hands while pleading ignorance about knowing I'm not a brain in a vat? And the reason is this closure principle that we invoked when we discussed the Mike and Ike case on the one hand and the goldfinches and warblers cases on the other. I mean, in the goldfinch and warbler case, it seemed really obvious that the only way you can claim to know that you saw a goldfinch is if you also can claim to know that what you saw was not a pine warbler. Because if it was a pine warbler, then it wasn't a goldfinch. Likewise, you can only claim to know that the guy you saw was Mike if you can claim truthfully to know that he wasn't Ike. Why? Because if he was Mike, he wasn't Ike, and if he was Ike, he wasn't Mike. The two are mutually exclusive. The closure principle says more generally that if I know that P entails Q, then I know that P only if I know that Q. Add to that the following really plausible claim. The proposition that I know I have hands entails that I am not a brain in a vat. First premise says that if I know I have hands, then I know I'm not a brain in a vat. Or the only way that I can know that I have hands is if I also can rule out in a knowing way the hypothesis that I'm not a brain in a vat. And you might say, well, why should those go together? Why can't I know that I have hands while pleading ignorance about knowing I'm not a brain in a vat? And the reason is this closure principle that we invoked when we discussed the Mike and Ike case on the one hand and the goldfinches and warblers cases on the other. I mean, in the goldfinch and warbler case, it seemed really obvious that the only way you can claim to know that you saw a goldfinch is if you also can claim to know that what you saw was not a pine warbler. Because if it was a pine warbler, then it wasn't a goldfinch. Likewise, you can only claim to know that the guy you saw was Mike if you can claim truthfully to know that he wasn't Ike. Why? Because if he was Mike, he wasn't Ike, and if he was Ike, he wasn't Mike. The two are mutually exclusive. The closure principle. What about our second premise? Why think you don't know that you're not a brain in a vat, or I don't know it? This, I think, is the more interesting part of the argument, and this is the part where we can really draw on what we learned from Descartes. Here's the defense of premise 2. I know that I'm not a brain in a vat only if I have evidence that rules out the possibility that I'm a brain in a vat. Now, this really is made up of two claims. One, in order for me to know that I'm not a brain in a vat, I have to have some evidence, right? Some reason to think I'm not. And furthermore, that evidence or reason has to be of a certain quality. It can't just be bad evidence or bad reason, nor can it be like decent. I mean, we're talking about knowledge here. We're talking about what you know. In order to know that you're not a brain in a vat, you have to have not just any old evidence, but evidence that rules out the possibility that you're a brain in a vat. Evidence that is, in Descartes' terms, certain. You need certain evidence that you're not a brain in a vat. Well, what is our second step going to be? If our conclusion is, I don't know, I'm not a brain in a vat, the second step clearly is going to be, I do not have evidence that rules out the possibility that I'm a brain in a vat. Now, I do have some evidence, right? What's your reason for thinking you're not a brain in a vat? Well, I mean, like, it doesn't feel like I am. Of course, here's the problem, though. That's something, but it doesn't definitively rule out that possibility. The possibility that you're a brain in a vat who is having these experiences of touching what feel like shoulders and thinking, well, there we go, that's good enough reason to think I'm not a brain in a vat. It's possible that you're a brain in a vat having precisely those experiences, not having shoulders, and being mistaken. And as a result, your evidence doesn't rule out that possibility. The evidence you do have are a bunch of sensations. But those sensations, here's one way to put the point, would be exactly the same even if you were a brain in a vat. And for that reason, they don't, with certainty, rule out that possibility. We can go back to what Descartes said about the dream hypothesis. Recall he said this, "As I think about this more carefully, I see plainly that there are never any sure signs by means of which being awake can be distinguished from being asleep." Likewise, we can say there are no sure signs by means of which you can distinguish the experiences you're having now from experiences that are caused by the supercomputer being pumping a brain in a vat full of experiences just like that. And so you don't have evidence that rules out the possibility that you're a brain in a vat. These two steps together constitute a powerful Cartesian or Descartes-inspired defense of the claim that you don't know you're not a brain in a vat. Knowledge, this is the takeaway lesson, according to the skeptic, requires evidence and furthermore very, very strong evidence. Evidence that rules out the possibility of error. And that sort of evidence is characteristic of knowing. You only claim to know something when you can be absolutely certain. We might have thought that we could be absolutely certain about having hands, but if the skeptic's right, that was a mistake. We just hadn't thought carefully enough about the possibility of outlandish scenarios, yes, but scenarios nonetheless that we cannot discriminate between in order to rule out. Just as somebody who claims to know that they saw a goldfinch, but who admits to not being able to tell the difference between goldfinches and pine warblers really doesn't know that they saw a goldfinch. Likewise, you cannot claim to know you have hands, but then at the same time say, yeah, but I can't actually tell the difference between a scenario where I actually have hands and a scenario where I'm a brain in a vat without hands being pumped full of hand-like experiences. If you can't tell the difference, you can't claim to know.